Chris O'Connor here. Join our fabulous curmudgeonly community on Facebook at facebook.com/group/curmudgeonrock. Also look out for a Spotify playlist dedicated to this episode. Now, let's get started.
This is the Curmudgeon Rock Report, and this is your podcast made by rock geek iconoclastic outsiders for rock geek iconoclastic outsiders. For those of you who lament that rock music has gone the way of jazz and slipped into niche genre status, we are here to keep that flame alive by providing insight, analysis, recommendations, and honest takes, not hot takes. And hey, there's a good chance you'll learn some rock history you never knew before. Creedence Clearwater Revival may have invented the template for Southern rock, and the Allman Brothers Band may have given it its soulful identity. But it was Lynyrd Skynyrd that codified its aesthetic, its style, its sound, and for better or for worse, its cultural ideology. We can wax rhapsodically about the instrumental virtuosity of the early Duane Allman incarnation of the Allman Brothers, and we can praise to high heaven the songwriting genius of John Fogerty and CCR. But really, it was Lynyrd Skynyrd who were the living, breathing, walking embodiment of not only Southern American rock, but also Southern American identity and all the cultural markings that go with it. Boozing, brawling, womanizing, working class solidarity, and stubborn pride taken to a nearly pathological level of stubbornness. When singer-songwriter Ronnie Van Zant led the band in the 1970s, they took deep Southern American roots music such as blues and country and gave it a riff-heavy hard rock crunch, as well as a devastating swagger that made being Southern seem cool. In fact, they resonated so much with a large section of the rock audience, mainly white, Southern, or rural, working class, undereducated, that they achieved an iconic, almost mythic status in their lifetime that matched their epic arena rock anthems. In a way, they were the American answer to Led Zeppelin. Then Van Zant and several other band members died in a tragic plane crash in 1977, giving Skynyrd's mythic aura an even greater boost and cementing their place in rock history. Of course, in the 1990s, Van Zant's younger brother Johnny resurrected the band, and they became the unfortunate torchbearers for flag-waving, gun-toting, Bible-thumping right-wing conservatism in rock. But we're only going to dwell on that toward the end. For most of this episode, we choose to focus on the good side of Lynyrd Skynyrd, the Ronnie Van Zant era that made them famous, legendary, and to this day, the definitive Southern rock band. No, we won't ask you to whip out and wave your Confederate flag because it's racist, and if you're American, treasonous. But you can crack open a bottle of Jim Beam whiskey, sit down, scratch your crotch, and indulge in some serious Southern-style cock rock conversation about Lynyrd Skynyrd, a checkered legacy. Welcome to the Curmudgeon Rock Report.
So this trip to the parallel universe, Arturo, is going to be something, because in it, blue truly is green and high truly is low, because we get to cover two of the best rock records this year, and we get to kind of explain and kind of riff philosophically about the meaning of the parallel universe now, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, it's rare that we're reviewing albums that we both really like, and we like each other's selections too.
Yeah, I was about to say, none of the usual tepid nonsense, or you don't get to. I don't get to be tepid about your stuff, and you don't get to shit on my stuff, because we really these are folks. We're going to cover what arguably will be the two best rock records or white boy rock records this year.
Right.
In America. And so I guess with that, we can get going. But just to remember, the concept here is that in a parallel universe, rock and roll would still be predominant and still be on the billboards and on the cover of Rolling Stone. And there'd still be such a thing as a cover of a Rolling Stone. And these are new and newish albums that we think that you dig. And so with that, Arturo, you're going to kick us off with one of if I'm the king gizzardologist of the Curmudgeon Rock Report, you are the OCSologist.
That's right. Yes, OCs, formerly known as the OCs, THEEVOOH, and then C's, SEES. A few years ago, several years ago, they just shortened their name to OCs, OSEES. They are one of America's preeminent cult bands, basically a vehicle for singer, songwriter, multi-instrumentalist John Dwyer. Since 2008, OCs have built a massive catalog that spans the rock gamut, encompassing straightforward garage rock, psychedelia, punk, metal, prog rock, and even jazz fusion. For their latest album, they've done something they've never done before, a totally guitar-free record. Basically, Dwyer recorded demos on keyboards at home onto a cassette, then transferred the cassette contents onto a sampler, using drumsticks to trigger each sound on the sampler. Augment that with OC's usual rhythm section of 2 drummers and bassist, as well as 2 saxophonists, and the resultant sound is one akin to 1980s new wave and synth pop, pumped up with anabolic steroids and given a hit of crystal meth for good measure. Intense and rocked the fuck out. The music on Sork's 80 also represents some of the best songwriting of Dwyer's career, with endless hooks, a surprising amount of flowing melodies, and possibly his angriest lyrics yet, homing in on the socio-political mood of the times. One of the telltale signs of truly great albums is how each track seamlessly flows into the other, building a palpable sense of momentum and eventual climax. And this record is no exception. Standout tracks include The Zipper, Look at the Sky, the rousing and anthemic Earthling, and the ambient funk workouts of Also the Gorilla and Lear's Ears. It's a 4.5-star album, and it's also one of OC's very best. I put it in their top 4. Chris?
Yeah, I think it's high up for me too, as far as OC's records goes. Yeah, this record is a lot of fun. I mean, it's basically space punk,
Yeah.
and what I mean by that is take that keyboard energy and the way that they do these songs. It's basically 3-piece punk songs
Yeah.
with the keyboards and the sampler pieces filling in for the guitar. And it's just a lot of fun. It's really ramped up with the saxophones. It obviously is paying somewhat of an homage to Funhouse by the Stooges.
Yeah.
So it gets there, and it gets off to a really great start. I love Pixelated Moon. That might be my favorite song on the whole record. That and Cassius Brutus and Judas.
Yeah.
Getting a little bit of Dante Alighieri-ness into the mix with that one. So yeah, John Dwyer pretty much outdoes himself. It's definitely the best thing they've done probably since 2019. And I think that their last couple records, I mean, A Foul Form was a fun exercise, but it wasn't much of an album. It was just basically 20 minutes of punk bash out, like lo-fi punk bash out, and then that last record, which meandered all over the place. So this is their best record in at least 5 years. And here's hoping that that Dwyer, I could see him continuing down this road and kind of doing this space punk thing, and I can see him doing getting more out of this sound. I mean, he's not the kind of guy that does the same album twice, or at least not in a row. But I can see him getting more mileage out of this sort of fuzz. What would you call it? Space keyboard sound.
Yeah.
It's pretty rocked out. Speaking of which, now we're gonna move into something that's truly rocked the fuck out. And we'll have a little bit of explaining to do because you may be surprised that we're covering this guy in the parallel universe. We're talking about Jack White and his new album, probably the best solo record of his career, called No Name. Now, Jack White is a bona fide rock legend at this point. We actually dedicated about almost 2 years ago at this point, we dedicated a retrospective episode to the White Stripes, his band with his ex-wife Meg on drums. And I've been reverent to Mr. White over the years on the podcast. But, the whole concept of the parallel universe is that in the parallel universe, rock and roll is still predominant. Rock and roll is still the thing. And this, in a lot of ways, is a comeback record for Jack White. And in a parallel universe, it would be a huge comeback, as in,
Yeah.
he would be scaling the mountain again. And this would be something that surges him back into relevance, like, beyond just the cult, beyond just the folks that actually still pay attention to rock here in niche world like ours here, the
Right.
folks that listen to, our target audience, in other words. It would be more than that. This album would be a breakout hit because it is really, really strong. And so let's talk a little bit more about Jack White's No Name. So on this album, White sings "It's Deja Vu All Over Again" on the song "Tonight Was a Long Time Ago," which is one of a number of absolute rockers that populate White's latest and probably his greatest solo album, No Name. On this affair,
Definitely his
yeah,
greatest solo album. Not even close to.
on this affair, he ain't lying. It really is deja vu all over again. White has spent most of the past 15 years creating distance between himself and his wonderfully minimalist rock band, the White Stripes, whether as a solo artist or a member of Pop Meisters, the Raconteurs, or the Dead Weather. He's delved into old school acoustic blues, folk rock, country, soft rock, and other styles during that time to varying degrees of success and, let's face it, quality. But now White has decided to return to the template that made him and his ex-wife Meg famous rock stars way back when on his sixth solo record, the unbelievably awesome No Name. It's the most rocking thing he's released since the Stripes' last record, Icky Thump. Probably the most rocking thing he's done since the White Stripes classic Elephant from 2003. So we're talking 21 years ago. And it's also by far the closest he's come to replicating the majesty of the White Stripes as a solo artist. Matter of fact, it's probably the only time he's tried. Thank God.
Yeah.
Maybe he figured he was due, that it was
Yeah.
just building up. And as we were talking about before we press play on this episode, maybe he just decided to say, you know what, fuck it, I'm going to make a Stripes record and just
Yeah.
just have just absolutely go into unapologetic nostalgia.
It sounds like the White Stripes with slightly better drumming.
Yeah, slightly better drumming because remember, Meg White was very underrated as a drummer, and it's probably his most rocking album, period, because it's so unrelenting. It's a 13-song record. Every single one of them bashes out. I mean, there's not an Apple Blossom style ballad like Apple Blossom from Die Style. There isn't anything gimmicky like the cover of Burt Bacharach's "I Just Don't Know What to Do with Myself" from Elephant. The quote unquote softest thing on this album is album closer Terminal Arch Enemy Endling, but that's only because the rhythm section drops out on the haunting psychedelic verses. Whoa, man. And like I said, you could say that, I could talk about the highlights of this record, but the album really is its own highlight. The
Yeah.
whole thing, it just keeps going. But personal faves, I'll talk about those. Bless Yourself, which is the second song on the record, which just rocks balls out, and it's absolutely, it's almost anarchic, and how it unfolds. He's basically scream rapping the lyrics on it,
Yeah.
and it's practically unhinged. There's the song "It's Rough on Rats," if you're asking, which probably has the best riff on the entire album. Just really, really good stuff. Probably the best song, objectively the best song on the album is "What's the Rumpus," which has a funky bass line and this little clipped, rock guitar riff, and then the solo on it in the middle of it is just absolutely inspired. It's just basically just blazing Axeman from Mr. White. And then there's Morning at Midnight, which is a blast of audio dynamite that probably shook the building's foundation when he recorded it.
Yeah.
There's a couple of things to note about the record. It's a family affair in some respects, as Jack White's wife, Olivia Jean, plays instruments on two songs, and
Yeah.
Jack's daughter, Scarlett, plays bass on two songs.
Mm.
And also worth noting is the release of this album was pretty unique these days, and pretty original and pretty creative. Jack White, as some of you may know, he owns record stores known as Third Man Records, and he owns stores in Detroit, Nashville, and London. Well, at those stores in mid-July, what he did is any purchase that was made in the stores, the purchaser also received a copy of this record on vinyl, as a freebie. And it was in a white jacket that just had the words "no name" on it. It didn't say that it was a Jack White record. It didn't say that. It just here's a free album, take it home. And then a couple people played it and said, "Holy shit, this is a Jack White record." And of course, like 3 days later, digitally ripped copies of it end up on eBay being sold for $500, uh, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
But anyway, what he also did is he did a couple of live shows where he handed it out to people who attended the live shows. And its formal digital release was on August 2nd. On August 1st, he made it available for sale at the Third Man stores. So it was just kind of a throwback that it
Right.
came out. He went the physical media route, and not only the physical media route, but affinity physical media, as in the people that are tried and true, and the people that actually shop for records at record stores. This one's for you. So it's like he hooked up the true believers in the power of rock and roll. So
Right.
pretty cool. I know you love this record too, Arturo, right?
Yeah, this is my top five of the year easily so far. An interesting thing,
Mine too.
if you look at the credits on this record, including Jack White, there are 10 people
Yep.
who played on this record, right? You had different bass players playing different songs, different drummers playing different songs, but it doesn't really sound like it. It doesn't sound like there are 10 different musicians
Right.
recording on this record. I know you talk about the bass. The bass is barely audible on most of the
Oh,
tracks.
I know.
That,
Yeah.
that's another reason why I call it a White Stripes record. You don't hear much bass except
Yeah,
for
it's very minimal. It's
it's
very
very
minimal.
minimal bass. The keyboards are way, way, way low in the mix.
Yep.
You have to really strain to hear the keyboards. For like 80% of this record is guitar and drums.
Yeah,
Guitar
and the guitars are just huge. I mean,
the guitars are huge. Yeah.
it's his biggest guitar sound since Icky Thump, the song Icky Thump.
Yeah.
I'm thinking
Right.
of it. It's just that
Right.
it's in that kind of realm. Think about boom, like the drums just bang, boom,
Right.
bang, boom, and
Right.
then within those spaces there's just those huge like pedal effect guitar type of
Yeah.
things going on. So it's a throwback for sure. Uh,
Yeah, and so
for
that's what strikes me when I hear this. Like, man, 10 people worked on this record. It sounds like only three people were on it.
yeah.
Jack, whoever the drummer was, and some other person doing bass and keyboards.
Yeah, and it just it's interesting because he did the two songs or the two albums in 22,
Yeah,
Fear of the Dawn, and the name of the other one is and Entering Heaven Alive is the name of the
yeah,
other one.
and neither of them were very good.
Yeah,
I wasn't a fan
Fear
of either
of
one
the
of them.
Dawn was okay. Entering Heaven Alive sucked. And so they were more singer songwritery, folk rocky kind of affair. And so
Right.
after that, that seemed to be the end of the road for Jack White. And it's like, hey, we revere White as a rock legend, and we'll always be interested in what he's doing, but it'll never be quite that relevant. Well, White has shook off whatever doldrums he's had, and he's returned to what he does best, which is rock the fuck out. Chris here again. Arturo and I have differing feelings about the subscription streaming service Spotify. While he likes to rail against the algorithmic component, I like the ability to find and then manage a personal catalog of music. The program is especially great for assembling playlists. Well, guess what? We've assembled a playlist to accompany this episode. The playlist features a healthy mix of all the music we describe and analyze during the episode. Think of it as a soundtrack to your curmudgeonly life. Find the link in this episode's description. And also become a member of our curmudgeonly community on Facebook if you haven't done so already. Let's now return to our regularly scheduled programming. Well, folks, this is an exciting one for me personally. Lynyrd Skynyrd, I've always thought, is one of the most underrated bands in American history. They don't get nearly as much appreciation as they deserve. And probably it's because of all of the Southern rock cliches and sort of Southern culture cliches. I think when most people think of Lynyrd Skynyrd, they think of a bunch of rednecks that drape themselves in the Confederate flag and drink too much whiskey. Hey, in fact, they actually do have their own whiskey these days. You know, the remnants of Lynyrd Skynyrd has their own line of whiskey. And so, kind of what they became in their reformed version kind of overtook what was back in the 70s, one of the more innovative rock bands in America, that a band that was able to take the blues and country influences of their native South. They were from North Florida, and combine them with the majesty of Led Zeppelin and the Rolling Stones, and the sort of the arena rock level of those bands. So I've always been appreciative of Ronnie Van Zant and Alan Collins and Gary Rossington and the other members of this band. Arturo, talk to us a little bit about Skynyrd, your thoughts, and then tell us about their origin story and leading into the rest of the story.
Well, before I go into the origin story, I always saw Lynyrd Skynyrd as redneck Zeppelin. That's basically
Yeah,
what they were.
yeah,
They were,
that's a good
you
expression.
know, they were the American response, much better than Grand Funk Railroad.
Yep.
The American response to Led Zeppelin. Anyway, okay, the origin story of Lynyrd Skynyrd is a long, twisting, winding one that includes multiple name changes, multiple lineup changes, and multiple disappointments along the way to stardom and success. As someone who spent his formative years living in Miami, I can attest to the fact that the further north you go in Florida, the more southern it gets. And it doesn't get more southern than Jacksonville, a city that, along with its surrounding areas, was the home of the young men who would form Lynyrd Skynyrd. Unlike the Allman Brothers Band, who were basically a band of southern hippies, Skynyrd's members were purely lower middle class, working class stock. And in the case of Ronnie Van Zant, straight up poor in one of the roughest areas of Jacksonville. This socioeconomic background would go on to be a big part of the band's identity and roughneck, tough guy image. It would seep into their sound as well, informing the no bullshit, meaty, in your face, sincere brand of hard rock that they would become famous for. After vacillating between wanting to be a boxer or a baseball player, 16-year-old Ronnie Van Zant finally had his music epiphany in 1964 and joined a local band called the Squires as their lead singer. From very early on, Van Zant showed he was a natural band leader, eventually changing the name of the band to Us. The newly christened Us won a local Battle of the Bands contest later that year against a band called The Mods, featuring guitarist and future Skynyrd member Alan Collins. Van Zant, however, was not happy with Us, feeling they weren't ambitious and serious enough to his liking. He left and befriended the member of a trio called Me, You, and Him, featuring Gary Rossington on guitar and Bob Burns on drums. Soon enough, Van Zant started playing with them during rehearsals and became their permanent lead singer. Former Mods guitarist Alan Collins soon joined the band as well, turning the band into a quintet. And by 1965, when they were teenagers, they had renamed themselves My Backyard. More name changes would follow. My Backyard became Conquer the Worm, then the Noble Five, and by 1968, they had settled on the 1%. Throughout the rest of the 1960s, the fledgling band played all over the Jacksonville area, developing their instrumental chops as well as their songwriting. Blues and country were their core inspirations, but they were also passionate fans of British invasion bands, such as the Rolling Stones and The Who. Over time, they combined these influences to mold a hard rock sound steeped in Southern tradition and flavor, yet bursting at the seams with attitude and gnarly redneck menace. A new decade brought a new name change, but this one became permanent. Tired of being mocked by some audience members as having quote unquote 1% talent, the band's drummer Bob Burns suggested an ironic lark by naming themselves Lynyrd Skynyrd. Lynyrd Skynyrd, the name of the strict high school PE teacher that they all hated. Remember, these guys all went to school together, right? Replacing the letters E and O in Lynyrd and the letters I and E in Skynyrd with all Y's. They settled on the more distinctive moniker we all know now, Lynyrd Skynyrd. By 1970, Skynyrd were one of the top bands in the Jacksonville area, headlining local bars and clubs and opening for touring national acts. With new bassist Leon Wilkeson and keyboardist Billy Powell, they were now a sextet and had drawn the attention of Alan Walden, the younger brother of Phil Walden, the founder of Capricorn Records, at the time home of the Allman Brothers Band. Walden became their manager and duly put Lynyrd Skynyrd on a relentless touring schedule, playing all over the nation's southern region. In 1972, they were spotted in a club in Atlanta by the musician and producer Al Cooper, notable for his work with Blood, Sweat, and Tears and playing keyboards on several Bob Dylan records back in the mid-1960s. Cooper was smitten and immediately signed the band to his own independent record label, Sounds of the South, which was distributed and financed by MCA Records. More lineup upheaval ensued as bassist Wilkeson briefly left the band during early recording sessions for the album. Thanks to Cooper's deep connections in the business, the band replaced Wilkeson with Ed King, former guitarist of the one-hit wonder psychedelic pop group Strawberry Alarm Clock. After the sessions were completed, Van Zant brought Wilkeson back into the group as their bassist, allegedly because he felt King was better suited to add a third guitar to Skynyrd's sonic assault. And that's exactly what he did, leading to the formation of the band's classic seven-piece lineup. But before we go into the classic debut album that this classic lineup produced, any thoughts on Lynyrd Skynyrd's beginnings, Chris?
Yeah, it's kind of funny that the guy from Us got together with the guys from Me, You, and Him. That's, that's a lot of pronouns. Yeah, I mean, hey, the synergy was there right from the beginning.
Yeah.
What can you say? And also, wasn't Strawberry Alarm Clock, weren't they the ones that did Incense and Peppermints?
That's them. Ed King was in that band.
And Ed King was in that band. So the Incense and Peppermint guitarist ends up in Lynyrd Skynyrd. So it just kind of shows you that music can transcend geographical boundaries, because that band was like from New Jersey.
No, actually, Ed King himself was from the West Coast, I think. I think he's from California.
No, I believe he's from Jersey. I mean, I saw a Robert Christgau review that actually had him as being from Jersey. So, take that for what it may be. But anyway, I mean, the interesting thing about Skynyrd is, how hard they worked to form that sound.
Okay, pause, Chris. He's from Glendale, California.
Oh, he's from Glendale. All right.
Yeah.
That's as far as I know, that's Orange County.
Yep.
Okay. Anyway. Anyway, it just, Jacksonville, there was something in the water because there was a lot of talent that came out of Jacksonville around that same time. Because, the band The Outlaws was from Jacksonville. And then you had Blackfoot, which was the band of one-time member of Skynyrd and future member of Skynyrd, Ricky Medlock. It's just kind of interesting that during this period when they were kind of going through lineup changes, Ricky Medlock was briefly in Skynyrd as a second drummer and backup guitarist and contributing songwriter. That there've been some early, they had some early Muscle Shoals sessions from 1971 and 72 that Medlock contributed quite a few songs to that eventually saw the light of day. So it's just interesting that there was that kind of talent and that kind of vibrancy in, of all places, Jacksonville, which, as you alluded to, is kind of like redneck heaven. And, area-wise, the biggest city in the country. It's like that, and Phoenix and Houston are like the three biggest cities in the country. So just, that's always been interesting to me. But, Ronnie Van Zant was an interesting character that, 16, that he wants out of his band because his bandmates aren't taking it seriously enough. Yeah. And he's 16. It kind of shows you the work ethic, and it kind of shows you the blood, sweat, and tears that went into what Skynyrd did. So really impressive backstory of how it all came together and how it all eventually congealed.
Yeah. All right, now let's go into the 5 Ronnie Van Zant era albums. Okay, and this basically is the core of Lynyrd Skynyrd, and especially the early records. So let's start with the first one, Pronounced Lynyrd Skynyrd from 1973. Aside from a greatest hits album, if you had to choose one, just one Lynyrd Skynyrd album to have in your possession as physical media or to stream constantly on whatever platform you use, the easy choice would be the band's debut album. They had been kicking around for years before this record came out, so it shouldn't be surprising to hear the sound of a fully formed and developed band clicking on all cylinders. In fact, this album provides the very essence of what the band was about and the purest distillation and representation of their trademark sound. A perfect album in which every song is great and most songs became staples of classic rock radio. It truly runs the gamut of the band's stylistic versatility. Gimme 3 Steps and I Ain't the One are basically ball crunching, full throttle rockers that yet swing and possess a grimy funkiness underneath the heavy guitar boogie woogie. Van Zant's heartfelt and yearning lyrics power the elegiac, emotional classic ballads Tuesday's Gone and Simple Man. The swampy blues boogie of the Deep South show itself with Things Going On, while the Al Cooper co-write Mississippi Kid is as authentic a slice of country blues as any of the original masters could have mastered. And of course, there's one of the band's 2 most iconic songs, the flowing, momentum-building, epic colossus, Freebird. Starting as a slow ballad of reluctant parting, it eventually builds into a breakneck pace of virtuoso guitar fireworks that threatens to leave the already galloping rhythm section in the dust. It wasn't just a rock radio hit. It actually went to number 19 on the Billboard singles chart. But more than that, Freebird is right there with Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven, the Eagles' Hotel California, the Beatles' Hey Jude, and the Rolling Stones' You Can't Always Get What You Want in the pantheon of lighter-waving, sing-along, never forgotten arena rock anthems. Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, that's really what you can say about Pronounced Lynyrd Skynyrd. It's the one that has Freebird on it. One of my all-time favorite songs. I still think it's the greatest solo that's ever been recorded on tape. And the amazing thing is that it was rehearsed, that there was no improvisation at all.
Yeah.
That was,
and the same with their live shows. All their solos were written out.
Yeah, all the solos.
They were not a jam band like the Allman Brothers.
No, they're not a jam band. That there was no improvisation. There was no riffing at all. It was note perfect. I mean, if you ever want to see it, I mean, when they did a show in Oakland, California, it's a famous footage called Big Field Day. It was a festival that was held at the Oakland Alameda Coliseum in '77. It was a few months before the plane crash that brought this band to an end. But Alan Collins does the solo, and Steve Gaines joins in at the end for the double solo part. But it's basically note for note as it is on the album. So the fact that they were that rehearsed and that sophisticated, and that well trained is pretty amazing. The one thing about this record I always thought that was kind of ironic is that 4 of their most well-known songs are on this record. Tuesday's Gone, Simple Man, Gimme 3 Steps, and Freebird are on this, but they're not the most southern sounding songs on the record. Those are the ones that didn't get released. I Ain't the One, Mississippi Kid, Poison Whiskey, which we hadn't talked about, but right. Those songs have more of the southern, more of the country, more of the blues. Right. I guess Gimme 3 Steps has some southern swing to it, right. Or some southern bop. But it's just kind of interesting to me that the absolute most southern stuff on one of the more seminal southern rock albums ever was the stuff that didn't see the light of day or hasn't been canonized in classic rock radio land.
Yeah, I know.
It's interesting to me.
It doesn't matter. It's 8 songs and they're all amazing. And this is Skynyrd's entry into the 500 greatest albums of all time.
And literally it is. It's at number 381 on the Rolling Stone 500 greatest albums of all time list from 2020.
About right. That's about
381.
Right.
Yep.
That's about right.
I agree.
Right. Oh, next, Second Helping, their second album from 1974. Remember when I said how most of the songs off Lynyrd Skynyrd's first album became staples of classic rock radio? Well, this is the other Skynyrd album chock full of some of their most famous songs, with at least 4 of the 8 tracks garnering constant radio play on any classic rock station devoted to the 1970s. Working for MCA is a gnarly stomper, as well as a sly commentary on the shallowness and greed of the record industry. Don't Ask Me No Questions provides one of the band's best ever riffs, courtesy of Gary Rossington, and with its souped up horn section is another brilliant example of the group's patented and original heavy hard rock boogie woogie sound. The Ballad of Curtis Lowe is a tender tribute ballad that defies the racist stereotype of Southern white folks. The Needle and the Spoon rides its catchy, chiming riff into another strident rocker, as well as a heroin cautionary tale. And the cover song, Call Me the Breeze, takes J.J. Cale's languid, laid-back groover and turbocharges it into a high-octane scorcher. And, of course, there's the second of the band's 2 most iconic songs, the sing-along country rock of Sweet Home Alabama. Their biggest commercial hit single and their only song to hit the Billboard Top 10. It's also one of their most provocative, controversial, and perhaps even ambiguous songs, something Ronnie Van Zant as a lyricist is rarely given credit for. Back in 1970, when Neil Young released one of his greatest albums after the Gold Rush, one of the most famous songs off it was the chugging rocker Southern Man, where Young condemns the virulent and extreme racism of the American South in light of the civil rights movement. Well, a proud Southern boy like Van Zant didn't take too kindly to a Canadian guy from way up north moralizing and being a bit preachy and self-righteous. Hence the lines in the song about Southern men not needing him around anyhow. But here's where it gets a little complicated. By all accounts of people who knew him, Van Zant was a huge Neil Young fan. And soon after the song became a hit, Young himself would express admiration for the band's music, even if Sweet Home Alabama slagged him. In addition, they reportedly even became good friends, with Young offering his song Powderfinger to Skynyrd to record at some point in the future. And while most of the song's lyrics glorify the region of Van Zant's upbringing, probably the most interesting verse in the song comes after the Neil Young reference. In Birmingham, they love the governor, boo, boo, boo. Now we all did what we could do. Now Watergate does not bother me. Does your conscience bother you? Tell the truth. Well, here's my interpretation. In Birmingham, not even the capital of Alabama, but whatever, it's the biggest city, they love the governor, who was the racist governor they had at the time for many years.
George Wallace.
George Wallace. Notice, they love the governor, boo, boo, boo. Van Zant is showing his hand here. He's no fan of George Wallace, okay? Acknowledging, the racist dickhead that he was, right? And now we all did what we could do, meaning, hey, we tried to vote him out. We didn't like the guy, but hey, he got the majority. Now, Watergate does not bother me, meaning, hell, I didn't vote for Richard Nixon. Does your conscience bother you? Because you motherfucker probably did vote for Richard Nixon. Tell the truth.
Yeah. So that's a pretty provocative lyric in a song called Sweet Home Alabama.
Yeah. Pretty sly, subtle, and thought-provoking for supposedly a gang of dumb rednecks. Hey, Chris?
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I'm saying that this band does not get enough credit for its subtlety. It doesn't get enough credit for the richness of what it had to say and how it said it. I like this album. I like this album as much as pronounced Lynyrd Skynyrd, actually, because I think that they kind of took the hint that the way that people received Freebird and Gimme 3 Steps, which which are very solo heavy, obviously.
Yeah.
And so they on this album they're soloing all over the place. Alan Collins is awesome on both Sweet Home Alabama and Call Me the Breeze. Rossington's got, like you said, Don't Ask Me No Questions is a Rossington showcase. And so just lots of great soloing on this record, lots of great guitar stuff. And even the song I Need You, which is just a slow burner, just has a lot of great soloing. Probably both those guys taking turns, Gary Rossington and Alan Collins, that is. And so I'm just really impressed with this record. It's really consistent and really strong. And like you said, it's chock full of classic rock goodness, like the first record. And so that's really where, these two records are really where they kind of got their reputation
Yeah.
from, and which was good because they kind of went into a little bit of a slump album wise.
Yes, they did.
Yeah,
Right.
for the next couple of albums.
Right. Coming up, Nuthin Fancy from 1975. By this time, Lynyrd Skynyrd were a big name band and had reached the big time, with Artemis Pyle now replacing Bob Burns as the band's drummer. Ironically enough, in my opinion, here's where the band's discography starts to offer diminishing returns. With this album, their innovative Southern hard rock style starts to become a bit cliche, not helped by a bunch of inferior bands who had started to imitate it. And Ronnie Van Zant's lyrics begin a slow progression into almost cartoonish redneck parody. It certainly shows in banal tracks like Made in the Shade, I'm a Country Boy, and Cheatin' Woman. The closing track, Whiskey Rock-a-Roller, tries to capture the manic energy of the previous album's album closer and catalog highlight Call Me the Breeze, but falls limp, really, due to its silly lyrics and lumpy chorus. But hey, this album does contain Saturday Night Special, one of Skynyrd's greatest singles and overall tracks, a throbbing hard rock funk hybrid that showcases Van Zant's staunch anti-gun, pro-gun control stance. Yet another example of how Van Zant may have been a boozing brawler, but he was no typical Southern boy. Chris?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, Saturday Night Special, one of the great anti-gun songs in the classic rock canon. It should be noted that this album really is dominated by Ed King.
Yeah.
King writes three of the better songs on the record.
Oh,
Saturday Night Special.
co-writes because Van Zant wrote all
Van
the
Zandt
lyrics.
wrote the lyrics, but so King, he writes the music. The Saturday Night Special, the
Mhm.
Railroad Song, and Whiskey Rock and Roller.
Yeah.
Whiskey Rock and Roller's okay. I know what it's going for. It doesn't quite get there, but it's at least more rollicking than the middle of the record. And like Made in the Shade sucks because it's the one song in Skynyrd's catalog that has a solo Ronnie Van Zant credit.
Right.
So Ronnie Van Zant was a great lyricist and a good melody guy, but he needed help with the music.
Right.
So that falls far short, and just kind of showed why he needed collaborators. But Ed
Yeah.
King was a damn good rhythm guitar player. He's not as well regarded as the other two, Russell and Collins, because they had the highlights with the solos and the slide guitar, and whereas King was more of a rhythm guy. But he stands out. I mean, the riff on Saturday Night Special is kick ass.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
Saturday Night Special's a badass song.
yeah, it really is. And so it's just kick ass. And King could play, and he belonged in that band. As far he was a spiritual cousin. He was not a son of the South, but he was
Yeah.
definitely a spiritual cousin. And it was a good note to go out on because this was his last record in this
Right.
first iteration of Skynyrd. He came
Yes.
back. He came back for the '90s relaunch,
Right.
but in this first one, this was his last record
Right.
with the band.
Next album, Gimme Back My Bullets from 1976. More lineup changes abounded for Lynyrd Skynyrd, as in the year before, during the Nuthin Fancy tour, guitarist Ed King left the band to become a born-again Christian, making the group a sextet again. More importantly, though, Al Kooper, who produced the band's first three albums, stepped down from the producer role, and his absence shows in the record's wayward sound and inconsistent songwriting. Simply put, not enough hooks, compelling melodies, or catchy riffs. There are a couple of great tracks, though. Gimme Back My Bullets, another anti-gun diatribe, grinds with a brontosaurus riff and sweaty groove that approximates Southern grunge. And the gorgeous ballad, All I Can Do Is Write About It, written by Ronnie Van Zant and guitarist Alan Collins, shows Van Zant never more endearingly wistful and sincerely touching in his love for his home area. Unfortunately, two classics cannot quite reclaim this mediocre record. Chris?
Yeah, I like this record, and I gotta be honest with you. I think it sounds great.
Mhm.
I think Tom Dowd replaces Al Cooper
Yeah.
as the main producer, and he definitely was more of an engineer than Cooper was. Cooper was a musician, He was an organist and he was a musician and had a musician's touch, whereas Tom Dowd is more of an engineer. So this album sounds great. And so what it lacks in hooks in some of the songs, it makes up for in Christmas. And the quality of the playing, the lead work by both Collins and Rossington is on point on this record. So just in terms of just as a technical achievement and just in terms of the musicianship, it's there. Songcraft, not necessarily. I mean, there's some decent songs, like Trust is a good song. There's another J.J. Cale cover on it called I Got the Same Old Blues. That's pretty good. And then the songs that you mentioned, obviously the title track and All I Can Do Is Write About It, were easily the two best songs on the record. But I just think that the quality of the sound is really strong, and the quality of the playing is really strong. So they're lacking in inspiration, but they're showing more. I think there's way more professionalism to this record than there is to the debut. And granted, I guess you can say that in a sense that sometimes professionalism can be overrated
Yeah, it really
because of
can
that.
be.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I do have to laud this record that listening to it again in researching and getting ready for this recording, actually it struck a chord with me more than it ever had. So it's really not as bad as its reputation suggests
Mm.
at all.
I'm not sold on it. Okay, the next one, the final album of the Ronnie Van Zant era, Street Survivors from 1977. New guitarist Steve Gaines brought back Lynyrd Skynyrd's three guitar attack, and a three female backing vocal section augmented the band's sound nicely enough that they became part of the band's live show. But while they continued to be one of America's best live bands and most consistent concert draws, their overall creative funk in the studio continued. That Smell is an angry anti-drug song and contains some of Alan Collins and Gary Rossington's most incredible guitar work and interplay. But Ronnie Van Zant's lyrics come off as preachy and as preachy
That's
and as
right.
sanctimonious as he accused Neil Young of being on Sweet
Yeah.
Home Alabama. Remember when I mentioned earlier about Skynyrd's songs descending into redneck parody? Well, here's You Got That Right, with Van Zant and Gaines trading vocals and singing the praises of drinking, dancing, and fighting all night.
Yep.
Add in the stale, flat production, and it's one of the band's dumbest and worst moments. The cover of Merle Haggard's Honky Tonk Nighttime Man is kind of useless and does nothing to enhance, nor does it provide an interesting take on the original. At least What's Your Name resurrects some of Skynyrd's vintage swagger and swinging honky tonk barroom rock. This was the last album they would do before the infamous tragic plane crash just 3 days after the album's release killed several members of the band and seriously injured several others, leading to the band's breakup. But before we get into that, Chris, I think you're a bigger fan of Street Survivors than I am.
Yeah, I am. This is their best record since Second Helping, and a very strong effort, and it shows what they were probably going to become
Mm,
because of Steve Gaines's influence on the album. Like you said, they were playing up the redneckiness, but they were going to become more of a country rock group.
yeah.
And they were trending in that direction because Gaines co-writes he has two solo credits and co-writes two others. He basically is the writer on half the record,
Mm,
and it's really really strong stuff. Like I Know a Little is a great little ditty. He co-wrote that with Van Zant, and it's basically like old school rockabilly
yeah, it
type
is.
type of playing, and it's a really neat little song. And I like You Got That Right. I mean, You Got That Right. It might be a redneck anthem, but it's a really really good redneck anthem. And Steve Gaines like co sings on that. He co leads, and I'd say that guy was a talent. I mean, and I think that they were going to kind of follow his lead. Like his influence on that record is really, really strong. And it's interesting. Rossington co-wrote "What's Your Name," and "That Smell" was a co-write by Alan Collins. I think that those are the only songs that those guys wrote for the
Yeah,
record.
right.
And so who knows? Maybe they were caught up in early life crisis, or maybe they were drinking and drugging a little too much, or something. But those are their strongest songs. I think that those songs are stronger than anything they did on the previous two records.
Mm.
Like I said, because Ed King was the star on Nuthin Fancy, and really Van Zandt is kind of the star of "Give Me Back My Bullets." I mean, some of his strongest singing is on that
Yeah.
record, but but it would have been interesting because they were going in a direction that I think they were starting to embrace their redneckness, as opposed to being kind of anti-redneck, or kind of
Right.
what would you
Yeah.
call it? It was more, they had been the thinking man's redneck up until then.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, they were the soulful rednecks, basically.
Yeah, the soulful rednecks and the thinking man's rednecks,
Yeah.
and but they were starting to embrace that sort of country identity. Like they were friends with Charlie Daniels,
Yeah.
and it kind of showed.
Yeah.
And like covering Merle Haggard. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean that's going from covering J.J. Cale to covering Merle Haggard is kind
Yeah.
of a statement. So chances are they would have. I could see them as like relocating to Nashville and really becoming a country band
Mm.
in the '80s had they lived. I mean, I think that that's the direction they were headed in, and so I think this is a really strong effort, and it really makes me sad that Steve Gaines died, because I would have been curious to see where he would have.
On this episode, we discuss the wonderful yet complicated legacy of Lynyrd Skynyrd. For the next episode, we plan to tackle another rock monster of the 1970s, Kiss. This quartet from New York City was one of that decade's biggest arena rock acts, and they did so by pioneering a brand of tawdry, sleazy hard rock and heavy metal that basically invented glam metal for the following decade. Thick, heavy guitar riffs, a pummeling but surprisingly swinging rhythm section, raunchy lyrics that touched on every base regarding having sex with women, an explosive, bombastic live show that included lights, lasers, pyrotechnics, flamethrowing, and coughing up blood, and, of course, those costumes. Black leather outfits with chains and diamond studs combined with Japanese style kabuki makeup to make these guys look like a gang of S&M bondage loving aliens from outer space. But more importantly, they rocked. Join us next time as the Curmudgeon Rock Report brings you Kiss in the 1970s. So, as I mentioned toward the very end of discussing their last album with Ronnie Van Zant, Street Survivors, a tragic incident happened in late 1977 that really ended the band for about a decade. And Chris, tell
Yeah,
us about it.
so what is the rest of the story of Lynyrd Skynyrd? So we've covered these five albums, and they really were kind of on top of the world as they were preparing to release Street Survivors. They were one of the biggest touring bands in America. They, the album came out three days before this plane crash, and debuted in the top 10 in Billboard, and had a couple of hits in That Smell and What's Your Name. And they were really heading towards being like basically like really like mainstream stars. Now, would they have been country stars? Would they have been rock and roll stars? Would they have straddled both worlds? We'll never know, because what happened was it was in October of 1977 that they had just started a tour. They had just finished the fifth date of the tour in Greensville, South Carolina, and they were chartering a plane at the time, like a small plane, and the plane was to go from Greenville to Baton Rouge. But what happened was is that they made a miscalculation, and they didn't fuel the plane enough, and the plane ran out of fuel.
Ugh.
And so they tried to make a crash landing. It didn't quite work, and they landed in a forest of pecan trees,
Mm.
and came down. Steve Gaines, Ronnie Van Zant, Cassie Gaines, who was one of their backup singers, both pilots, and a road manager, all died on impact. Everyone else survived, but were really banged up. Gary Roston broke his neck. Artemis Pyle had broken ribs. Leon Wilkeson broke his arm so bad he couldn't play for several years because he needed physical therapy for that. And so they were really banged up, and they were devastated and traumatized, and it effectively ended the band. They came to a complete halt, with the exception of in 1979, surviving members of the band, with the exception of Leon Wilkeson, joined Charlie Daniels on stage to do an instrumental version of Freebird with a spotlight affixed on the mic in the front as kind of a tribute to Ronnie Van Zant. And so they went dormant for most of a decade, and then starting in 1987, they started to get the bug again. During this time, Alan Collins and Gary Rossington started a band called the Rossington Collins Band. Hey, imagine that.
Very
And
creative.
yeah, and I think Pyle was in that band with them, and Powell might have been in the band as well. But they didn't want it to be a not to be compared, or they didn't want it to be seen as Skynyrd light. So they made it seemed like a wise decision at the time to hire a female singer to front the Rossington Collins Band, until Collins and Rossington both fell for the singer. Dale, I think her name was, and she ended up marrying Rossington, but Rossington and Collins ended up having a huge falling out because of that. And so Alan Collins went in his own direction and started the Alan Collins Band and did that for a few years. But Collins had it rough because in the early 80s, his wife died of a brain hemorrhage. And so between the plane crash and the hemorrhage and an already forming drinking and drug habit, he really got to be in bad shape, and to the point where in 1986 he had a car accident, a DUI, killed his girlfriend, and led him to be paralyzed from the chest down from that point on. And so just really rough times for Collins, and not necessarily the band, but besides Collins, everyone else got to the point where by 1987 they were ready to play. Not coincidentally, that was coming up on the 10th anniversary of the plane crash. So Rossington, Powell, Pyle, Wilkinson, and Ed King was back in the fold at this point. They got back together and decided that they were going to go on the road.
Do you think they did a Southern rock version of Incense and Peppermints?
Probably not. Yeah, and so you had those guys, and a guy named Randall Hall, who was in the Alan Collins Band, filled in for Collins and played the Collins role. Okay, so they're going to get back together. They're going to go tour, and they're basically going to do like a greatest hits type of show. Who do they get to sing? Well, lo and behold, Ronnie Van Zant had a little brother, a much younger brother, 12 years younger, named Johnny Van Zant. Johnny Van Zant was 17 and still living at home with his parents when the plane crash happened in 1977. Well, they decided that and he had started a musical career. They also, Ronnie and Johnny had a brother named Donnie, who was the head of a band that many of you have probably heard of, 38 Special. They had two huge hits in the 80s that are still memorialized for all time on classic rock radio. Hang On Loosely and Caught Up in You. My local classic rock station in Houston plays Caught Up in You all the fucking time. I'm tired of that song at this point. But anyway, Johnny Van Zant gets hired to fill in for Ronnie. Kind of sounds like Ronnie, kind of looks like Ronnie. Turns out he didn't have Ronnie's talent. More on that in a little bit. So they did this tour, and it was a very successful tour. And what they found is that people still had an appetite for Southern rock and for Skynyrd and for, what they had come to represent, that sort of Southern pride, the stars and bars kind of whiskey drinking, bell bottom pants wearing pride. And so there was still an appetite and there was still a market for that. And so by 1991, they had they had resumed life as a real band and as a working band. And those guys that I mentioned, plus Van Zant, they did the album Lynyrd Skynyrd 1991, which is wholly mediocre. And it's really kind of a shame because what happened was you had these guys that they were feeling it. It was therapeutic for them to be back as a band and to be back on the road and to be playing and making music again. But they were coming across at this point as a band without leadership and as a band that they basically they sounded like a band that had been reared on Second Helping and Street Survivors and was basically a bar cover band.
Yeah.
That they had that kind of thing going for him. So it was really disappointing. Ed King was back in the loop, and he was actually he was basically the chief songwriter at this point.
Yeah.
He was along with Rossington, but King was writing a lot of the stuff. So it's kind of interesting that he went born again Christian, but came back to Skynyrd when they decided to reform, and was in the band for almost 10 years uh, until then. And so that was the beginning of it. And so they were wholly mediocre, and it only got worse from there because they kind of embraced their standing as the sort of the redneck forebears
Hmm.
of Southern rock and what had become sort of a country rock, where you had split offs like Charlie Daniels and 38 Special and some of these other 80s bands that or the Marshall Tucker band was another one of these uh, phony Skinner bands as well. And it just kind of went downhill from there. Johnny Van Zant was corny as hell as a lyricist and not the most inspired band leader. By 1997, I will give them credit that it's not like they didn't find guys that couldn't play, that they went out and got two of Jacksonville's finest.
Yeah.
Ricky Medlock, who I mentioned before, spent about a year as a second drummer and session player for Skynyrd in 71 and 72. He came back as a full-time guitarist. He's the one that plays Freebird when you go to see them in concert. So he's one of the few guys that can play Freebird and do it well. you know. And The other guy that they brought in was Huey Thomason, who had been the band leader and lead guitarist for an actually pretty awesome, another underrated band called the Outlaws. You remember High Tide and Greengrass,
That was a
or
one big hit. Yeah.
yeah, or Greengrass and High Tide, I think it was called. It
Right.
was, but just really awesome solo on that. That's Huey Thomason, and so they came in and they joined the band. But again, by this point, it was remember when you could keep your doors unlocked. I mean, that was kind of a theme of Johnny Van Zant. It's kind of like living in the nostalgia of what the South used to be,
Right.
and without meaning to be, comes across as white pride.
Yeah.
But Van Zant, he comes across as likable. I mean, I'll give you an excerpt from an interview he did last year for a magazine called Flamingo, where he talked about his role in the get back togetherness of Skynyrd. He says, "quote It took 10 years for the guys from Skynyrd to get back together. They offered it to me in '86 or '87. I really didn't want to do it. I was surprised they offered it to me, but they wanted to have myself. I wanted to get my brother Donnie involved, but he was in 38 Special and it had just started happening, so he wasn't able to do it. So I agreed and said, let's go into rehearsal. We went into rehearsal, and the thing about Skynyrd is it's never just been a band. There's bands out there that don't even talk to each other. I know. I'm around them. We're not friends. We're we're not friends. We're family. And to get into that rehearsal was like I could see the joy of those who had survived that awful plane crash. Now the spark had come back to them. I couldn't say no.
Mm.
I couldn't
Yeah.
say no. And honestly, it's been a spark for me. It's made me closer to my brother. I've learned a lot about him that an 18-year-old probably would not have known about a 28-year-old guy. I wish it had never happened. I went to see BB King one time, and this guy would bring BB a red Solo cup and a wet towel. And for some reason, it hit me. I said, I'd like to have been that guy for Ronnie. I would hope that he would be proud of me, and one day I hope to be able to talk to him whenever I go up to the good Lord's house. I know myself, Gary, and all the surviving members, we really tried to. We've never went on stage and called it in. We've always gone on stage and said, let's give it 110, 120, 130%, whatever we have in us. I would hope that they would be very proud, and I think he would be. And so, I mean, this is a guy that you want to like. I
Yeah.
mean, there's nothing inherently wrong in anything he just said, and
Right.
it's not like he's misguided. He just is. He's not his brother,
Yeah.
His brother was a special talent who had just had kind of a hippy dippy take on where he was from.
Right.
You know, it's like it was like he was an untethered take on being a redneck from Jacksonville,
Right.
whereas Johnny Van Zant was a very tethered redneck from Jacksonville, and
Yeah.
and just couldn't help himself. I mean, again, they started off as wholly mediocre with Lynyrd Skynyrd in 1991, and by the end of the road, they haven't done a record, thank God, since 2012. By the end of it, they're just an insipid country rock party band that's emptier than a bag of old beer bottles.
Yeah.
I mean, seriously, they might as well be that house band in the movie Roadhouse. You
That's what they
know,
became. Yeah, they
yeah,
became.
that really is what they became,
They
and
became a cliche and kind of
a
a parody
parody.
of themselves.
Yeah, they became a parody of. They became a southern rock parody. Just
Right.
rock from the South parody,
Right.
and it really got kind of crude and offensive because you think about it. We talked about Saturday Night Special earlier, which is like
Mm,
one of the great accomplishments. You're talking like a southern redneck band that displayed Confederate flags on the
right.
stage doing an anti-gun song. And so
Yeah.
here's my favorite lyric from Saturday Night Special. It says, "Handguns are made for killing. They ain't good for nothing else. And if you like to drink your whiskey, you might even shoot yourself. So why don't we dump them people to the bottom of the sea before some old fool come around here and want to shoot either you or me?" And so, really wise lyric. And then you contrast that with the title track from 2009's awful album, God and Guns. The title was in response to an ill-advised remark that Barack Obama had made during the 2008 presidential campaign that people in rural America were clinging to God and their guns and were living in fear, which
Which he was right about,
yeah,
and he's still right.
he's basically right about, but he was a little crude and is a little too generalistic. Having lived in a red state for the last 7 years, it's a little too general. But anyway, there's the title track, which Johnny Van Zant did not have a hand in writing, and neither did Ricky Medlock or Rossington. It was written by some, but bunch of third party guys. But here's a lyric from God and Guns. "I'm here in my back of the woods where God is great and guns are good. You really can't know that much about 'em if you think we're better off without 'em. Well, there was a time we ain't forgot you caressed all night with the doors unlocked, but there ain't nobody safe no more. So you say your prayers and you thank the Lord for that peacemaker in the dresser drawer." So this is the same band, and this is what they had devolved into. They
Yeah.
really had forgotten their sense of independence and their flair
Right.
for making you think. Like I said, they
Right.
went from the thinking man's redneck band to the dumbest possible redneck band.
Right.
And remember, this is an album that was fervently supported and endorsed and promoted by Sean Hannity,
Yep.
the
Fox News.
conservative talk show host, radio guy, and Fox News host, who's basically his show is basically the RNC gives him talking points and he just goes off on the talking points.
Yeah.
So by this point they were basically a Republican shell kind of
Yeah.
band. And so, and then more dumbness to share from Johnny Van Zant. That same album, God and Guns, has a song called "Skynyrd Nation" on it, uh,
Skinner.
unironically titled "Skynyrd Nation." And
Lord.
here are some of Johnny's brilliant lyrics from that song: "Motorcycle ladies hugging up to their daddies. Oh, teenage bangers, they're all getting ready. Open those gates, gonna rock tonight. Oh, when those lights go down, it's a beautiful sight. So put your hands in the air, give us all you've got. We're feeling right. Gonna take all night to rock this joint the way it's supposed to be. Young and old, three generations, bold generations. We've been told it's a Skynyrd nation."
It's like dumb white version of Chuck Berry.
Yeah. Yeah, pretty much. More like Chuck Barris, the Gong Show. And then their last album was released in 2012 called "Last of a Dying Breed."
Mm.
Thank God. Boomers from Jackson, a bunch of boomer recovering drug addicts from
Right.
from Jacksonville. "Last of a Dying Breed," I'm sure. One and then the lyric from that song: "One horse towns and one night stands, just like my daddy. I'm a traveling man. I'm not the kind to settle down. The roar of the engine, I love that sound. I hear the highway calling, oh, feel the breeze. I've been around playing and gambling, but Lord, I'm free. Saddle up, baby, right up close to me. An open highway is all I ever need. Last of a dying breed. Pardon me one sec.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
and the music is just it's just cliche Southern bar band rock. There's nothing
Yeah.
interesting about it. It doesn't have the majestic, breathtaking sweep that early Skynyrd had, in
Yeah,
their
and
music.
it's worth noting that when they got together in 1987, they had five original members
Yeah,
that were part, or actually, it was four original members plus Artemis Pyle
yeah,
that
right.
were so basically five guys who had been in the real band
Hmm.
started, and it's worth noting that they peeled them off slowly through that period. Pyle quit before they released Lynyrd Skynyrd in 1991, so he never made it to record. There, Ed King left before 1997. That's when Ricky Medlock and Huey Thomason came in. Uh, Leon Wilkerson died of liver disease in his hotel room in 2001. Billy Powell died of a heart attack in 2009. Billy Powell, great piano player. He doesn't get enough credit for being a part of he might have been the most virtuosic player, you
Yeah.
know.
Well, he was a classically trained pianist.
Yeah, and the other guys were just they're more like self-taught rock guys, you
Right.
know, and not quite as virtuosic. They were powerful, but not virtuosic. So Powell was probably the most virtuosic player in the whole band. So he died in 2009, and then Gary Rossington just died last year
Mm,
after a brief illness.
right.
He died. So none of the original members of the band are alive at this point.
Wow.
Ed King is also dead.
Yeah.
So yeah. So now it's a bunch of scabs that are left. It's Ricky Medlock. I guess you could say Ricky Medlock gives him a little bit of authenticity because
Right.
he was part of it before pronounced Lynyrd Skynyrd. He was in there for a year in 71, 72, and
Right.
he was in Blackfoot, so he's part of the original scene. But other than
Hmm.
that, it's like it's him. They're like a bunch of other old man bands these days. It's like one kind of sort of original member. It's the brother of an original member and like five scabs.
Hmm.
Yeah, and there's a
Yeah.
lot of
In
bands
other words,
like like the
it's shit not
Drifters.
worth talking about.
Yeah, the Drifters and the Coasters and all those kinds of bands.
Right.
It's always like the second cousin of a brother of an original member of the band, you know. So it's kind of gotten like that. So really they're not worth they're basically a jingoistic band of boomer recovering drug addict rednecks
Yeah.
at this point. It's really pathetic
Yeah, I mean,
what it's
listen, the
become.
name
Go ahead.
the name of this episode is Lynyrd Skynyrd, A Checkered Legacy. And the reason it's checkered is because the post-crash Skynyrd, okay, they wanted to embrace their redneck, what would you call it? Their redneck image or their southern pride. They want to put that up front. Okay, I mean that's not too bad. But when they started combining that with openly embracing right-wing conservative politics,
Yeah.
and that's when they actually lost some fans. And when they basically relegated themselves as just the Southern right-wing conservative redneck band, Lynyrd Skynyrd,
Yeah,
instead of
and
the
you got
great
to
band, Lynyrd Skynyrd. And I really do think the post-crash Skynyrd, even though they were kind of successful, they had their fans. I really do think it kind of, I hate to say this, but I do think it kind of marred the early Skynyrd. It kind of put them in a bad light.
yeah, I
Because
mean it
I
did.
mean, we should think of 1970s Lynyrd Skynyrd as one of the great American bands, and they were. But when we think of them, they're always going to be attached to the hip to what came later.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
and that's why post crash Skynyrd has kind of like marred and left a black mark on the good Skynyrd. They kind of brought the good Skynyrd down a little bit, I think.
Yeah, and I think part of this too is that there's been a reckoning really since the Me Too era launched
Yeah,
in 1917 2017.
yeah,
And since the George Floyd based riots in 2020, there's been a reckoning for the Confederate flag.
Yeah.
that they actually were still displaying, they were still allowing the Confederate flag to be displayed at their concerts up through 2019.
Mm.
They tried to put us to stomp it out in 2012. It didn't work, and so they finally were able to kill the Confederate flag at their shows starting in 2019. So the fact that they went so long, you look at the old footage, like I mentioned that amazing set that they did in Oakland, California in
Yeah.
1977, which is documented in a film
Mm.
that VH1 has shown in the past. You know, the big festival show at Oakland Alameda Coliseum. The stage was adorned with Confederate flags.
Yeah.
And so you see that imagery, and you're like, for them, it was Southern pride, and we know, and from their songs, that Ronnie Van Zant and the other guys, they were no racists. I
Yeah.
mean, you don't do a song like the Ballad of Curtis Lowe, and you don't do a
Right.
song like Sweet Home Alabama and get away with some of the lines that they did in there if you're if you're a cracker.
Right.
But I think that the ideology of what the flag means and what that flag means, it's seen as a menace to black
Mm.
people. It's seen as a
Yeah.
menace to liberal
Because
whites.
it's the flag the Ku Klux Klan used. It's the
Yeah,
flag of the Ku Klux Klan. And also, if you really are an American who's proud of your country, that flag
it's
is a
traitorous.
symbol of treason.
Yeah,
It's a symbol of treason.
yeah, it's traitorous. It literally is treasonous. And
Yeah.
so it was innocent Southern pride, but then over the decades, the connotations became too strong to avoid. And so I
Right.
think that skews, and why I think that Skinner doesn't get the credit it deserves because of that connotation with the
Right.
old South
Right.
and some of that imagery, and which is too bad because I mean, really that first chapter of Skinner, those first five records. I mean, yeah, the Nuthin Fancy and Give Me Back My Bullets are not great records, but
Yeah.
they have great singles.
Yeah.
And so, just there's a really strong candidate, to what they contributed to rock, to bring in that Southern sound, to sort of Zeppelinize the South. They
Right.
Zeppelinized the Southern rock thing. And
Yeah.
then towards the end of their run with Street Survivors, they were countrifying Southern rock.
Right.
And I would have been really interested. It would have been really intriguing to see where they would have been by 1982. Like how preeminent Steve Gaines would have been, whether Rossington and Collins would have still been,
I kind of think they would have sucked. I kind of think they would have sounded like 38 Special. They,
yeah, they
you know,
probably would have gone. They probably would have sounded like the electronic drum kind of thing, like what happened to everybody else in the '80s.
yeah.
They would have gone the way of ZZ Top and Golden Earring,
Yeah.
and they would have kind of had that kind of sound. Although, I mean, God knows I love both those bands, but they would have kind of had that same kind of. They would have sounded more like 38 Special,
Yeah. Yeah.
but they would have, but with like way more talent.
Yeah.
Washington, Collins, and Gaines and Van Zant were all strong songwriters.
Right.
So it would have been more well written, but it would have sounded like that kind of
Yeah.
stuff,
Right.
you know.
Right.
So and they would have been closer to Charlie Daniels band. I think that's that's the direction they were heading in because of Gaines.
Yikes.
They were definitely countrifying. So
Yeah.
I don't know. Would have been interesting, but yeah, it's a checkered legacy because they did some great songs, and they were a meaningful band that just kind of got snowed under by its own mythology, and really, they kind of got swept. They got clobbered by PTSD.
Yeah.
Could you
They really
imagine?
did. Yeah.
I mean, they were in a plane crash and they all survived except for two of them.
Right.
Well, three of them if you include Cassie Gaines. But like,
Right.
a seven-piece band, five of them survived a plane crash. They all have
Mm.
that in common. So now
Yeah.
they're the band that survived a plane crash. How do you really focus in on the music when you're dealing with that together? It was almost like a group therapy session
Yeah. Yeah. I know.
if you think about it. And poor Alan Collins, he had tragedy after tragedy after tragedy. You know,
Mm.
like he couldn't even like win the woman in his band.
Yeah, that's poor guy.
Yeah,
And
man.
and then he becomes a disabled person in a wheelchair.
Yeah, dies of pneumonia in 1990. I should mention that
Yeesh.
he died young.
Yeah.
So just really unfortunate, but still, At their best, pronounce Lynyrd Skynyrd's Second Helping, Street Survivors, great band with great music and great singles that will always be on the radio. Freebird will forevermore be the greatest solo ever recorded on tape by anybody ever.
Yeah, and that is the legacy
Inarguable.
of Lynyrd. Yes, I agree. And that is the legacy of Lynyrd Skynyrd. And with that, we come to an end with this episode. Like I said, if you really want to focus on the best of Lynyrd Skynyrd, get those first 2 albums.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and a smattering of the stuff from the other records. And just for the heck of it, on the Spotify playlist, folks, we'll include some of the bad stuff just so you can appreciate how bad it got. The worst of the rest is what we'll call it. So with that, folks, as we always do at the end of these episodes, we encourage you to join our Curmudgeonly community on Facebook. Art's back to posting up there regularly. I'm about to get back into rotation. I have some ideas. We'll a lot of merriment and mirth to be had in our community. So please join us. Join us at facebook.com/groups/curmudgeonrock. It's invite only. The chances are, unless you're a deviant, we'll let you in. Other than that, if you disagree with us about Skynyrd, if you think that they were just sucked and you think they're the most racist cracker pieces of shit in the world, let us know that. Write us some fan mail at curmudgeonrock@gmail.com. And as we said, we'll have a Spotify playlist. We've been doing this all year. Here in 2024, we'll have a Spotify playlist. Hell, I might just drop all 5 records into the playlist. You'll be able to find the link to that playlist in our episode description, wherever you're accessing this episode, whether it's on Apple or Stitcher or Amazon or wherever else you access your podcast.